A political standoff in Washington. It can feel pretty distant, right? But it's about to create a ripple effect that touches the entire country. Today, we're going to break down the 2025 government shutdown and really see how it impacts millions of lives, not to mention the economy itself. I mean, seriously, think about that question for a second. What happens when the world's largest economy just stops paying its own bills? It sounds completely absurd, but that's exactly what happens during a shutdown. And this goes way beyond politics. We're talking about very real-world consequences when the money just gets turned off. The stakes are incredibly high. Okay, so where does all this begin? It all starts right at the epicenter, a political deadlock in Washington. Let's dive into how we actually got here. So, what even is a government shutdown? We hear the term all the time. Well, at its core, it's pretty simple. It's a failure to agree on a budget. When Congress can't pass the necessary funding bills, huge parts of the federal government are legally required to just stop working. Everything pauses until a deal is finally reached. Now, to really get what's happening now, we need a little context. This isn't exactly a new phenomenon. This is actually the 22nd shutdown since the modern budget process started back in 1976. Now, the average one lasts about 8 days. But the longest one? That stretched for over a month. So history tells us these things can be resolved pretty quickly, or they can drag on and have some really severe consequences. So what's the hang-up this time? The 2025 stalemate really boils down to this. Republicans need to get 7 Democratic votes over in the Senate to pass their funding bill. But the Democrats are saying, nope, not going to happen unless they get an extension for some healthcare subsidies that are about to expire. And since neither side is blinking, well, here we are. Deadlock. And that deadlock? That's what creates our first ripple. The government itself just grinds to a halt. So when a shutdown hits, the government basically splits in two. You've got your essential services, think air traffic controllers, military operations, mail delivery. Those folks have to keep working. But then there's everything else, the non-essential functions. And that's a huge list, covering everything from advancing NASA projects to staffing national parks. All of that just stops, dead in its tracks. But there's this one consequence that's absolutely critical, and honestly, a lot of people overlook it. It's something called the data blackout. Think about it. The very agencies that collect all of our most important economic data, they're considered non-essential. So what happens? Key reports, like the monthly jobs report, the inflation numbers, they just get postponed. This creates what some people call a data scarcity fog. It means policymakers, like the folks at the Federal Reserve, are basically flying blind when they have to make huge decisions about things like interest rates. Okay, so let's follow that next ripple, because this is where a shutdown stops being some abstract political story you see on TV and becomes intensely, intensely personal. We're talking about the human cost. Just look at that number. Around 3 million federal employees are directly hit by this. They're either furloughed, which is a fancy word for being sent home without a job to do, or if they're deemed essential, they have to keep showing up to work, but with no idea when their next paycheck is actually going to arrive. But here's what makes this 2025 shutdown so different, and frankly, so much more severe. This isn't just about temporary furloughs anymore. In a pretty unprecedented move, the administration is using this funding gap to issue permanent layoff notices, what's officially called a reduction in force. This transforms that feeling of uncertainty into a very real threat of losing your job for good. And this quote from an employee, wow, it just captures the chaos and panic perfectly. They said, "I think I may have been fired, and I don't have a way to find out." Why? Because the layoff notices were sent to their official government email, which they're locked out of during the shutdown. Can you even imagine that level of anxiety, thinking you've lost your job but having no way to confirm it? And these layoffs aren't random. They're very targeted. We're talking over 4,200 notices sent out across 7 different agencies. The Department of Education, for example, has seen its staff basically cut in half. And we're seeing deep cuts in really critical places like the CDC, parts of the IRS, and offices that handle fair housing and energy efficiency. And this financial strain is hitting military families incredibly hard, too. Now, they did manage to secure funds to cover the October 15th paycheck, but there's absolutely no guarantee for the next one. For so many of these families who are already living paycheck to paycheck, just the possibility of a single missed payment creates an unbelievable amount of stress. Okay, so for anyone watching who's directly affected, there are some immediate steps you can take. You can apply for something called Unemployment Compensation for Federal Employees, or UCFE. And get this, even if you don't have the official forms because you're locked out, you can still apply using an affidavit and some proof of your earnings, like old pay stubs. Just one really important heads up, if you get back pay after the shutdown ends, you will most likely have to pay back any unemployment benefits you received. All right, that leads us to our third ripple, and this one expands way out, shaking the broader economy and even the financial markets. And there's a really simple rule of thumb here. The longer a shutdown lasts, the greater the economic damage. It's that simple. It eats away at consumer confidence, it slows down economic activity, and it just injects a ton of uncertainty into the markets. Now, if you just glance at the stock market, you might think, what's the big deal? At first glance, the reaction seems surprisingly calm. Historically, the S&P 500's average return during shutdowns has actually been slightly positive. It kind of seems like investors just shrug off the short-term political drama. But that is not the whole story, not by a long shot. You see, that calm average hides the real risk. And his quote from New York Life Investments just nails it. The longer the shutdown, the greater the volatility. And volatility just means those big, wild market swings. So as the shutdown drags on, the up and down movements get way more dramatic as investors get more and more nervous. And that brings us to the final piece of this, the aftershock. This is the damage that sticks around long after the government finally reopens and the immediate crisis seems to be over. Because at the end of the day, a government shutdown isn't really the disease, it's a symptom. It's a recurring symptom of a much deeper problem, which is just this ongoing fiscal and political dysfunction. And that dysfunction just erodes credibility on so many different levels. First, you've got policy credibility on the world stage. Other countries start to question if the U.S. can get its act together. Then you've got political trust right there in Washington. As Senator Lisa Murkowski points out, this lack of trust between the parties just makes it harder and harder to solve the next crisis. And maybe the most important one, it corrodes public trust. It leaves people feeling demoralized and questioning if the government can even do its basic job. Which leaves us with this final critical question. Look, the shutdown will end, the government will eventually reopen, and the paychecks will start coming again. But every time we go through this repeated spectacle of dysfunction, it chips away at something that's way more valuable and so much harder to rebuild, public trust. And you really have to wonder, is that damage becoming permanent?